All right, welcome back, everybody. We're here for part 2 of our conversation on the basic needs budget. And again, this is we're here with Dan Dickerson, and I'll just let Dan jump right in.
Okay. For the record, I am Dan Dickerson with the Joint Fiscal Office. I know there are a lot of new faces here. So for those of you that might not be aware, we serve essentially as your fiscal counsel. So legislative counsel, they're drafting the bills, doing the legal research. We're helping you manage the state finances. And we wear a lot of hats as part of that work. One of those hats being having the responsibility of putting out this report every 2 years. And so it's been helpful to have Ellen walk you through the history. And so what I'm hoping to go into, there are sort of two big pieces. I think the primary piece is just walking through the mechanics of the report. I'll try not to go too deeply into the weeds, but obviously, for those of you that have questions that beg of that, then I'm certainly happy to go there. But I'll try to keep it, relatively high level. And then, so that's the first piece. And then the second piece that Ellen hinted at is it's our desire to sort of have another review similar to what occurred in 2008. And so I'll go into that at the end. I put together document. Okay. Sorry about that. Full screen mode. Okay. So I've got a slideshow here that is just going to go into a few of the pieces of the report. And then at the end, I'll sort of go through the actual structure of the report and maybe jump back and forth. But, first I wanted to walk you through a couple of definitions. So in statute, the General Assembly has defined what basic needs and a basic needs budget means. So basic needs means the essentials needed to run a household. And it outlines those expenses that are a part of that equation: food, housing, transportation, childcare, utilities, health and dental care, taxes, rental and life insurance, personal expenses, and savings. And then a basic needs budget is the amount of money needed by a Vermont household to meet those basic needs using the best data that we can find. So primarily federal data. That's our best resource. And so as I noted, what expenses are in the 2022 basic needs budgets? And I guess just to stop for a second, we're in 2023. The reason it's a 2022 budget is we're always looking back at the data that's collected. And so as far as we can go, given, the data that we have, the inflation knowledge that we have, is 2022. And so that's why the budgets are 2022, even though we're in 2023. So those expenses as defined in statute are the food, the housing, which because of the data we have, utilities are a part of the housing piece, transportation, childcare, health and dental care, insurance, personal expenses. There are two additions that actually aren't spelled out in statute, clothing and household expenses and telecommunications. I can't remember when those were added, but they have been a part of the calculation since I've been doing the study, which goes back to 2014. So like I said, 9 years in. And then savings and taxes. And as I noted, the red lettering means that those expenses are defined in statute. The black is just something that was added after the fact. And then what is the livable wage? So this is, we've got all these basic needs budgets that pertain to different household configurations that I think go back to the genesis of the study. So we have a single person, we have a single person with one child, a single person with two children, and then we have two adults sharing housing or living together. Our assumption is that they're two adults in a relationship. And then we have two adults with two children where one of the adults is not working, but is providing childcare. And then a two-adult household with two children where both adults are working. So those are our six family configurations. The livable wage is calculated from taking that two adults, no children family. And by the way, we do an urban budget and a rural budget using the best data that we have to sort of create some space between the two, acknowledging that costs vary across those areas. So we take that two adult household with no children, and we look at the urban and the rural wage that's spit out by, summing these expenses over a year, and we take the average of that to create the livable wage.
Representative Justin Tangent.
Thank you. On this particular slide, this definition, I know you had to choose one to be representative of the average or typical. Is this a larger demographic block, or is it just because you had to choose one? Because I wonder, how many people fit this?
I think I can give you an answer, and I think Ellen could probably also give you an answer because she has more of the history. But I would say that, this very question is something that should be considered if you choose to do another technical advisory council. What are the demographics now? We have 2020 census data. I haven't really been able to dig into those details to see, what are the types of household, what are the predominant household configurations in Vermont today. I would guess that back in 1999, that was what the census showed was sort of the predominant makeup. Or actually, I would think that most two-adult households probably would have had more children then than they do now. But so I don't, as far as the history, I can't give you an answer, but I would say as far as where we are today and some of the questions that it would be great to have an outside body come in and consider is where should the livable wage be calculated from? Should it continue to be from this two adult, no child configuration? Maybe there should be multiple livable wages. And I think it's a worthy question to be considered among a bunch of worthy questions.
Well, I think it does consider, I think there are different livable wages. I think we just come back for this one. This always struck me as not only is this about a family household as we hear the word used as we're dealing with the homelessness situation where people are referred to families or the way that the government counts them is as households. A household could be a single person, it could be a family, it could be children, a family with children. This also includes, I think, with some qualifications, almost like a roommate situation. I mean, because that gets it down to, it costs this, if I'm sharing an apartment with you, it still costs what it costs. The rent is still going to be, $2,000 a month, and I'm ostensibly responsible for half of that, even if I'm not in a relationship with you. And so but this kind of gets to the relationship between a minimum wage and a livable wage individually as opposed to the household wage. Does that make sense?
So, yeah, I gather.
It's not just me and my wife bringing in a combined income. And that's what I kind of like about it because it gives it I don't share my health insurance with you. Right. So
right.
It doesn't always account. It doesn't always.
Yeah, and it does. I mean, that's another consideration. In the past, we've actually had another household configuration where it is two adults that are not in a relationship. They're just two people that share an apartment. But we found that the wages weren't really that dissimilar from either, a single person or this two adult that are, it's basically rather than having a one bedroom, you have a two bedroom. But other than that, per person, the expenses are pretty close to the same. Because as far as health insurance, if you're two people, you don't really get an extra. It doesn't save you money. It's just doubling. If you would pay $80 a month or $80 a pay period as a single person and 160 as two people, there's not much difference there. So there's no savings there. It's really the, if you're in a relationship or not in a relationship or not cohabitating, I don't know what the best term is, but it's really just the rent that you save
That's
money.
just it. What's the best term? So,
And so the other assumption here is, and this is something I think has been in the report from its genesis, was we assumed that employees have employer-assisted health insurance. There was a period of time after the Affordable Care Act passed where we did have a separate category for the urban families and the rural families, where we would say folks that have employer assisted and folks that are buying from the health exchanges, and it just became too complicated, and so we went back to just showing the employer assisted. But it's another question that I think could be asked is, how many families out there or households out there are buying from exchanges or have sort of a different, aren't receiving employer assisted healthcare coverage, and should we consider having maybe at least one household where, here's what the wage would be if they have health insurance provided by or subsidized by their employer. Here's where they're buying it on their own, or they're receiving a smaller subsidy from the federal government.
and I think the last I want you to keep going, but one of the things that stands out about this too is that we're still talking about, you use the word demographic, the fiscal demographic of making 13, whatever the number is, for this year, if the livable wage is $13.50 an hour, we're talking about a 40-hour week of being under $30,000. So that's just like, that's the demographic we're talking about here too. So that question about would it be Affordable Care Act insurance or would it be employer insurance is it's a valid question or point to consider, understanding the complexities of it. But just that, we're talking about a population, if they're only getting paid $13.47 an hour or $13.50 or whatever it is this year, it should give us a picture of where it fits with AMI. It should fix, what levels of poverty, how many, so that's how broad this can go. But we can't really ask middle class questions of expenditures, and we have to realize that under this $30,000 a year income or less, what can people afford for the basic needs budget?
So you've gotten the definitions. You understand that the basic needs are this list of expenses that we tally using the best data that we have to add up to these annual wages, which then we can divide into an hourly wage. So what you see in front of you now are the basic needs budgets that I calculated for urban households. And so I've got the 2022 numbers on the right, and you can compare those to what they were in 2020. And I can give you a sense of the drivers, although I think you're probably all well aware that the biggest in these, I guess before I go into what the drivers are, since I've been doing these calculations, this is by far the biggest increase in basic needs budgets and the livable wage, far and away. And you're not even seeing, when I get to the rural households, you'll really see how dramatic this is, but this is substantial. And so I won't go through the numbers. You could see them on the screen, but inflation is a huge factor for rural households. Transportation is a big factor because there was one data source that changed that actually made a big difference for rural families that tended to drive more. But inflation is a huge driver. What was helpful for folks to reduce the tax burden was the passage of the child tax credit for Vermont, and then the expansion of the child independent care credit for Vermont. Those have those have reduced the tax burden, although it does, because the tax expense goes down, it does depress the wage a little bit, but they're paying less in taxes, which, most families would say that's a good thing. But inflation just across the board is a huge factor here.
And Dan, can I interrupt for just a second? And Caleb, can I get your help on what is a tax expenditure?
A tax expenditure is the cost to the state of our tax policy. So if we put a tax credit in place, then there's a coinciding expenditure associated with it, which is calculated typically through a fiscal note at the time we consider the policy. And so each part of our tax code can be quantified in terms of what it costs the base, because basically these things, so when we put 50 million in the child tax credit, it's basically 50 million that hits the base every year. And that's what it is.
Thank you.
So here are the rural wages, and you could see, changes from 16 to 20% over what they were just 2 years ago. And a lot of that is inflation, but a big piece is, I won't go into the weeds, but there's transportation has always been, or at least going back several court cycles, has been a challenge to calculate. And so one of our sources, in the way they calculate a number that we use, changed their methodology, which for rural families that drive more really made an impact on those budgets, which is unfortunate, I think, because I think it's beyond just the inflationary pressures. I think it's creating this sort of bubble that, or maybe bubble's not the right word, but I think it's creating an artificial inflationary factor that, if I had more time or maybe if we have a technical advisory council, they can look at, maybe there's another way that we can calculate this that won't create this sort of artificial inflationary factor. But it made a big difference on these rural budgets, and you can see, 20% increase is substantial.
Representative Elder?
You're talking about transportation and fuel costs being that factor?
Not fuel costs.
Non-fuel costs.
Yeah, I think as I go on, I'll go into the methodology, at least for transportation, a little bit further on, just to. Okay. But it actually wasn't tied to fuel costs.
Okay, and then just to clarify, in here, the assumption is these theoretical individuals making these wages would not be receiving any state benefits, or are you calculating at each of these wage points the theoretical benefits they would get and kind of mapping that into the livable wage equation? Or is this sort of like we're pretending benefits don't exist? These families,
I think the goal when the report was created was that what are the wages needed to not have families on subsidies? But I will say that there are certain tax expenditures that go to much higher income levels. The child tax credit being an example, all of these families qualify for that. And so, I guess it would depend on what your definition of subsidy is. If child tax credit falls into that category, then yes, they are eligible but for a lot of like the really low income programs, these families aren't eligible. The wages are above those levels. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that answered I think that, income sensitivity around property taxes, participation in Dr. Dinosaur. These are examples of subsidies that some of these people would qualify for, but yes, I take your point. Yes, nonetheless, yeah.
And that chart that Ellen showed us with the benefits, the potential benefits, and where the cliffs are. But I guess, did you get an answer to the?
I think the answer is no, those are not in here. So that basically if one of these families did qualify for a child tax credit, you're not basically counting that in their benefit towards what they need for a livable wage. You're not subtracting their child tax credit from the livable wage they would otherwise need in this chart.
Actually, I am.
You are.
The child, because it's a tricky. That's a tricky part of the calculation because, we take all this, we pull all this data, we add up those expenses, leaving aside taxes. And then we almost have to create this feedback loop, or I have to create this feedback loop because you get a wage at a certain level and then you calculate what the tax burden is, including any tax credits or deductions that they would be eligible for. And that then gets tallied to overall expenses, which then creates a wage that then has to be taxed again. And so we have to do this circular calculation where the taxes are added to the expenses, which creates a wage, which then creates a new tax rate, which then feeds back into the wage. And finally, I land on,
Okay, but they're in there.
an
That's great.
equilibrium, but they are in there.
Thank you.
And if you look at the actual budgets that Dan's.
Yeah, they are in the
that we can
report.
see.
Yeah, thank you.
Representative Lamont?
Thank you. Just to clarify, so, and when you get to the 2 adults, you would be, that's per person, right? That's-
Yes.
So that would be per person. So,
Except for there's the two, well, yeah, it is per person. Each one of the 2 adults is per person.
and so then if, like I'm just looking at those numbers, never mind. I'm not gonna go down the rabbit hole. Thank you.
Okay.
Just a small puddle.
And then finally, here's what the livable wage is. It's about a 14.5% increase from 2020. It's going from 1339 to 1533. And then I've got this little note that, it's calculated from that 2 adult family or 2 adult household, no children. And it's the average of what the rural wage and the urban wage is.
I'm sorry, can you go back for just 1 second? So it went up almost $2.
Yeah. And once again, far and away the biggest increase I've ever seen. And I think it's probably bigger than any increase prior to my time.
Sure.
If I had to guess,
It is.
it's substantial.
No, that is substantial. I just wanted to make sure my glasses didn't need refocusing.
And I've got a couple of slides that, will show what expenses, what categories of expenses are really driving these increases. But
And this year's minimum wage is like 13.20 something, right? Or
that is actually my next slide. So once again, this is a look back. So yes, the minimum wage in 2023 is 13 something, but this just shows how the livable wage and the state minimum wage and obviously the federal minimum wage never changes. So that's a straight line. But this really shows what the state minimum wage looks like against the livable wage.
it's just to linger on the minimum wage. Again, this is just an educational point. If this had gone back another couple of years, it would have shown, the last time we raised the minimum wage was to it was $10.50 an hour, and then we just did a 2-step up to $12.50. And the statute, so any number we see after that, that's been increased by 5% or the rate of inflation. So this year it was 5%, whatever's lower, which is the first time I can remember it ever going up as much as 5%. It's usually been 2 or 3%. The buying power is still whatever we set the minimum wage at. So if it was at $12.50 in 2020, say, which it's not, but the buying power is as if it was $12.50. It's just inflation is taking it up. It's an inflationary increase. So this idea that the minimum wage is now 13 something is, again, the buying power is $12.50 from when we made it so. And we haven't changed it in a while. We haven't changed in a couple of years, not a while, but just a couple of years now. But that's just a little factoid of how we deal with minimum wage, and certainly in comparison with the federal wage, which has not changed in, I don't know how long, since 2003 or something like that.
I want to say, 2000, 2001 timeframe might have been the last time, but that's a complete guess. So maybe I shouldn't even say it. It's been a long time. So the next 2 slides are charts that just show, I've got the expenses colored. And I apologize if there's anybody in there that has trouble distinguishing colors. I'm happy to modify these charts and send them to you. I in the past I've tried to do charts that have little shapes in them, and it ends up looking really terrible. So I defaulted back to colors, but like I said, I can send you a modified version. But so these are the urban households. You've got the categories of expenses on the right here. You can see, I'll start here at the bottom. So for housing, the cost actually went down slightly. And that's not something I made up. That's just based on the data that we got, and the housing data that we used is from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, with fair market rents for the urban households. It's the Burlington metropolitan area. So oddly enough, those rents decreased slightly from when I last looked at this data in 2020. Food costs, if you bought a dozen eggs recently, you're aware that those have gone up just a little bit. So you can see that reflected here. Childcare is an interesting one because we rely on a survey. It's a market rate survey that goes out from the Department of Children and Families within Vermont. So this is actually Vermont specific data that we get that shows what the costs are for childcare. The survey hasn't been done since 2019. I believe they'll be releasing some data this summer, but unfortunately it wasn't in time for this report. And so I had to, look at some sort of inflationary factor that takes into account the overall inflation, but then the historical inflation of just childcare, because it's such an interesting segment of what we spend money on. It's different from food or other things. So that increased pretty dramatically. Transportation went up a little bit. Health and dental rates. This other category is sort of the clothing, the telecommunications. And then there are a few of these that are really driven by other expenses. So savings, for example, that's 5% of total expenses. So as those expenses sort of feed in, it drives that savings rate. And then the same with taxes. As you add up expenses, your tax rate or your tax burden, increases or decreases based on whether your expenses are going up or down. Taxes would have gone up more, but for the fact that, that child tax credit passed, which reduced the tax burden for at least state tax burden for a lot of families. Same with the expansion of the child dependent care tax credit.
I wanted to make a comment. So this very much, I see this in my community. I work at the South Burlington Food Shelf, and we have had the highest, this month, we've had the highest amount of folks coming in that we've ever had in history of the food shelf. And which is really concerning. I'm glad that folks know where to get resources, but I mean, it's really concerning that folks are so they have to figure out where they're gonna get a basic need met. So that's coming into the food shelf, and it's just been, hundreds. It went from like even when the pandemic started, and I started there a few years ago, like 10 people, like during the day. Now I get there's like a line out the door, and so it's really alarming.
I can definitely, every time I go to the grocery store and walk out, it's depressing. So I completely
Absolutely.
understand.
Yeah, and there's folks that, that live next door to me who are, single income, younger-ish folks as well, who are like, this is where I have to get assistance right now because the groceries are just, so I feel it. Thank you.
Representative Chestnut.
Oh, yes, sir.
So just the second column, single person, one child, doesn't appear to have a tax liability. Is that?
Well, so this is showing the delta or the change from 2020 to 2022. So they do have tax liability, but it hasn't gone up, and that's because it's one of the assumptions that feeds our calculation. So if you're a one-child family, then we assume the age of the child is 4 years old. If you're a two-child family, then one of those children is assumed to be 6. you are no longer eligible for the child tax credit once your child reaches 5 years of age. So that 6-year-old is not eligible for the credit. So you see where having the one child, it reduces or it keeps the tax rate flat. Having the 2-child, it's helpful for one child, but then this older child isn't eligible for the credit. So you see that tax burden going up a little bit just because all those expenses feed what the tax burden ends up being. So that's the quirk there.
What's the quirk with the single person? I mean, the increase in taxes on the single person.
Well, that's just because there's not a child there to collect, to receive a credit on to offset the increase from all of those expenses that are driving your wage up, for the purposes of this study. So that, if the state of Vermont or if the General Assembly had not passed the child tax credit and the expanded dependent care credit, you would have seen this level of increase across the board.
Okay.
And so with that, based off of the,
Yeah, okay.
thank you. With the base of the age of the children, if the families that have children that are above 6 years old, where are they calculated into that demographic?
Well, you're certainly still paying some level of childcare expense for a 6-year-old. They most likely in school, but on either end of the day, you might be paying some childcare. So they're a part of the expense calculation, but it's just when you go to file your taxes, you can't claim a credit for the 6-year-old because they've exceeded the age threshold. Does that answer? And the food expense is higher because you have to feed another person. The housing expense, well, I think regardless of whether it's a 1 or 2 child household, I think we assume if you have a 2-bedroom house, so you've got the adult in one room, then the child or children sharing the second room. But so there are expenses that are tied to the 2-child. It's just the second child, because we assume that one child is 6 years old, isn't eligible for that credit.
Representative LaBelle.
I can understand where you're coming from when you said, the child 6 years old or older in school, so they might need childcare before and after. But what about during the summer or when there's school vacation?
Yes, also during the summer. So we, I think, going a little bit into the methodology, I think for a 4-year-old, I've still assumed, basically a full year of care, although we do have pre-K, but because there hasn't been a market rate survey, I don't really know how pre-K is impacting childcare costs. So I think that's probably an inflationary factor that might not be accurate on my part, just because I haven't assumed the pre-K potential benefit at this point, because I just don't know how it's actually playing out in the childcare realm. But yes, I think as far as the assumptions, we assume that the 6-year-old is receiving care during the summer, and so that's a cost to that household.
Thank you.
So these are the urban, I guess, the changes that Delta. Why is this? It's not showing up. Sorry. This is a weird Adobe thing where sometimes it just shows a blank screen when it shouldn't. So I have to close it. Reopen.
It's a built-in feature to give our brains a rest every now and then.
So convenient.
I like that. Used to be changing the paper.
Yeah.
Shared.
What?
Geez, the difference. The increase in carpal tunnel syndrome. They say for.
All right, here are those rural families. So you can see, just dramatic increases, and the big driver, at least for these 2 adult families, is this transportation. It's just due to that. It's mainly due to that quirk in the data that I can, if you guys are really interested after the fact, I can talk about it. But tax burden overall going up more just because expenses overall are rising more. You can see that with housing, the rural cost of housing has gained ground on urban. And you can probably get a sense of that when you talk to your constituents in rural areas, especially if you live near like a ski resort or desirable outdoor recreation destination. You've probably heard people saying that the cost of housing has gone up a lot. And so you can see that reflected here.
Representative LaValle?
Thank you. So what about heating fuel? Is that in the other category or is that in the housing category?
That's a part of the housing expense that the HUD data
Okay.
assumes. I think utilities are assumed to be about 15%
Oh, okay.
in that data. So we just go off of that.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Parsons?
Thank you. I guess my question would be, you said fuel cost doesn't play a factor in the transportation.
Well, it does, but sort of indirectly. I think when I get into the discussion of what a technical advisory committee would look at, I can walk you through that methodology just to say where we are currently and why it's complicated and it merits some looking at of, is there a better way of calculating these transportation costs? But I can walk you through it. Fuel, the cost of fuel does play a role, but it's, I'm not looking at what the cost of a gallon is at the pump and then building that. It's sort of, it comes in indirectly, but I'll explain that.
Okay, I'm just, in my head, I'm thinking that it plays a pretty big role in rural because of the driving. I mean, it's shown in other slides, the miles driven. And
I think in my head, I would expect transportation costs to have increased more for a rural household, but I think these big gaps are above and beyond what they should have been. Like I said, that's in my head, trying to sort of think analytically about what it should have been. I think this is too dramatic, especially considering it's only hitting these households and not these households.
Representative Elder?
Oh, okay. Never mind. There's no childcare in the second from the right because one of the parents
Yes,
is doing all the childcare.
correct.
Got it.
And I think to the point that Representative Parsons and Representative Elder made earlier about transportation, I think there's a contemporary facts or, situations like housing is too expensive in town and the service industry people who would fit this economic demographic have to live further away. So there must be something to say about the increase in travel time, cost of the car, cost of gasoline and upkeep. But again, it's harder to have a fixed point on, I would imagine.
Well, it's hard to, there's not a data point that captures all of that in one place. We sort of have to, we reach for a few different data points. And, I think we're at a point where I'll walk you through the transportation methodology and hopefully I can say it in a way because it's even me thinking about it, it's complex. But so we, as a base, we look at what's called the National Household Travel Survey. And this survey is done, I think, about every 7-8 years. It's done by the federal government. It's actually a survey that we can, each state can sort of pay a little bit extra into to receive more robust data. And that feature is a part of what has complicated the transportation cost calculations. But it actually generates, they interview all these families and they get a sense of how much average families are driving each year. And they actually break it out by, families living in urban areas, families living in rural areas, by state. And so when you have a lot of responses and a good, robust data set, it's useful. You can get a sense of how far people are If you don't get a lot of responses and you don't have robust data, it's really hard to look at it and say, that makes sense. You know, it's not enough people, especially once you break it out, like, okay, if I had just the national average, that's one thing. But now if I say, okay, I want Vermont, then I want urban and rural families in Vermont, then your responses get so thin that it's not reliable anymore. And so the most recent survey was done in 2017. I think we did not pay for the additional outreach. So we got very few responses compared to the last survey, and it created some really weird data that we've had to modify to really make it make sense. And Tom Cavett, our economist, actually helped with the last study create this sort of new methodology that we could limp along with until we had somebody, until we had the General Assembly either say, JFO, figure this out and present it to the Joint Fiscal Committee, or let's appoint a technical advisory committee of some outside eyes to look at this. So as a starting point, we get this vehicle miles traveled for the best we can for these different household configurations for urban and rural families, Vermont specific. And then we modify it by two additional factors. The first is there's the IRS each year posts a mileage reimbursement rate that you folks are all probably familiar with, because if you're driving here, you're getting that rate applied to your mileage. That's where those costs of gasoline are captured, because that goes up and down based on, what are the prevailing drivers of transportation costs? Are they going down, going up? So that IRS reimbursement rate has gone up, and in fact, it went up again on January 1st of 23. So that's where those fuel costs are captured. But that's only one rate. And so we modify that rate using what's called the AAA cost to drive. And this is a report, not so much a report, but just a fact sheet that AAA puts out each year, where it says, based on the class of car you drive, if you're driving an electric car or a small sedan or a pickup truck, and based on the amount of mileage you drive, this is your cost to drive. And it's, they have it broken out by, on a per mile rate. And where it got really funky is, historically, we can use this cost to drive for, their baseline is, I think, 15,000 miles a year. And then if you're 10,000 miles or 20,000 miles, your cost per mile might go up or down. Historically, if you drive more, your cost goes down because there's some of those fixed costs, like your registration, your insurance, that gets distributed across more miles traveled. So it effectively makes your cost per mile go down, even though, you're paying more for gas, you're paying more for maintenance. And so, there's usually, between somebody driving 10,000 miles, somebody driving 20,000 miles, the cost per mile has varied pretty significantly. And they changed their methodology so that those came a lot closer together for this report, which resulted in those rural families that drive more having their costs increase a lot. And it's
so some of this, so what you're getting at is, speaking of the weeds,
yeah.
is what you're getting at is that some of the methodology, which this bill that's coming out based on work done with you and with some of the methodology needs to be reaffirmed, I think is the best word I can think about it, because it sounds like what you're getting and what you've used is no longer as credible as it was when you first took it in.
Yeah.
Or assigned it to this purpose.
And I think having our office make a determination and then having the Joint Fiscal Committee affirm that is problematic when it's potentially a big change that's going to make, this year's calculations stick out a lot from prior years. I think I've tried to avoid big methodology changes when I've done this because I'm aware that we, just like you don't want your data sources to change dramatically, and the federal government, when they send out surveys, don't want to vary too much because you're going to create these big gaps that are sort of weird, sort of like what AAA did. And so I think it gives me pause to consider big methodology changes without having, some different sets of eyes look at it and go, what does this mean for the broader livable wage, the basic needs budgets? And transportation is certainly one of those data points that we would love to have, a committee or some set of individuals look at closely.
Representative Elder.
Yeah, and I don't know if it would be in those, but I think of like what the price of used vehicles did in the last couple of years, and who knows, maybe those get into some of, if we extrapolate a long-term methodology change from something stemming from the recent pandemic or just, the huge influx of federal cash. If you looked a year ago and tried to say, what is a semiconductor chip going to be worth today, you might have put a really high number on it. Indeed, a lot of manufacturers did, whereas what's in the news today is they're all selling at a loss because, surprise, they all made a huge glut of them at once and now the market's flooded. So it's just like when we try to extract, we are in the midst of, all our data has recency bias of its own. And if we start to extrapolate that kind of recent data point, this chart's it's very eye-catching, those blue bars on the right. And I think that a serious grain of salt should be.
That's what it sounds like from what Dan is saying.
No, I'm just kind of giving a private sector example of the same thing that we can see in the news today.
So overall, I just again point out for our perspective, this is a tool, and it's an imprecise art with science added. But it's an imprecise art to try to, if Dan and JFO has to balance out the credibility of each of the sources that may have been very credible in our opinion 3 years ago or 3 terms ago, and they're not anymore, then how does he formulate a tool that we can then look at, which is broad anyway, right? It's not there's no set distinction. It's as amorphous as what the level of poverty is, but it's a useful tool for us. And so to have the source be so, Dan, I'm sorry, you're like stressing out so much trying to get across.
You guys are like, what is this? What's this guy talking about?
I want to acknowledge that for your purposes to provide us with this kind of information, which you strive to get as accurate as possible, if you can't provide, if you have to say this year's basic needs budget can't be compared to the last one because your sources changed so much, but the methodology changed so much. Again, that speaks to why we have to look at it again and renovate it and make allowances for that, because we can pick at anything that's happened contemporaneously. You can't in this, and so, or it shows up 2 years later or what have you. Representative Chestnut Tangipahoa, then Elder.
So, at the risk of belaboring this unnecessarily, doesn't it seems to me that keeping the AAA change in methodology, which presents a glaring
skewed
picture here, but a skewed picture in the change, the delta in expenses. But it seems like the underlying broader list of expenses would be more accurate than in the past. So the delta is alarming, but the end result of the actual expenses may be more accurate than.
Well, I would say that I would expect transportation costs to have increased dramatically, especially for rural families, and we're seeing a fairly significant increase. But I'd say because these are so much more here, I think there's a part of that yes, that it looks very glaring in the delta, and maybe it's a little more diluted in the overall picture, but I think it's driving those wages more than is probably accurate within transportation because of that weird methodology change.
Yeah, I think you mentioned dilution, and I think you were talking about a different thing, but I would say that it may be reasonable to just average transportation years over a longer window to kind of get some dilution of that data set.
Yeah.
We did the same thing, you know, and a lot of, had we used our regular formula for our school budgets, ADM, average daily membership, we would have had totally catastrophic equalized people calculations coming out of the pandemic. So instead we just said that year doesn't count. We're not counting that year. We're just going to count these 2 years an extra time. And that's data that doesn't ever hit our formula because we know it would blow up our formula. And you know, it's like, I think we got to get a little bit used to doing that. And one way you do it is you take the weird data and you just average it over 3 years and you plug it back in as though it was 1 year's of data. You know, it's like, because what else are you going to do? You know, it's like a big weird thing in your data set that you either throw your formula out the window or you blow it up with data that really shouldn't be in there. It's like, so just skip those years. That's weird. It's out the window.
That's kind of what they want to do with this, with the study.
Yeah. But you know, the trick is that if we want to do a significant change to the methodology, we have to take that to joint fiscal committee. And as you might be able to assume, you know, you've got this committee that, you know, probably during the summer, they're trying to not think about being here, you know, dealing with constituents. And then we bring them in and just like dive into this really complex conversation of here's why this data is tricky. Here's why we want to change it. It's challenging. I also understand why, you know, it's good to have an outside body look at what we're doing and just have a different perspective and go, okay, that makes sense. But it's definitely, you have to bring them up to speed on the whole thing and then dive into this really detail, like, well, because AAA changed their, you know, or, you know, something. So,
And on that,
it's tricky.
yeah, just over the last, I think Dan first brought this to us previous biennium, COVID kind of wiped us out in terms of having time to think about how this kind of conversation. When it came up again last year, there was a bill to do this, but there were some folks who thought, well, it's just technical changes, right? And former Representative Hooper, you know, we were saying, should we have this conversation in the Joint Fiscal Committee, which is the summer committee that determines expenditures when we're not here. And there was a little bit of energy behind it, but then Representative Hooper was just like, but wait, this is a political decision. The choices of how and what we're measuring is a political decision. For Dan, it's not. Their work is technical, but for us, and that's why it's going to be in a bill. And that's why it's back here, because essentially we choose, by choosing what we're measuring and how we're trying to measure it, that's a political decision and it's a substantial change. It's not just a technical change. And so that's why we're considering it this way, that we will be changing. If we do change the methodology, it'll start with the summer committee that will then make recommendations to us that we have to approve, which is a political gesture. So I just wanted to point that out. This is not just the facts. It's the facts as we wanted to see them determined. To your point, Representative Elder, you know, it's like we added telecommunications because people had cell phones. There wasn't just a landline anymore. And so anyway, that's just trying to get more information out for us to understand.
And so that gets, there is one slide here that just goes through what the structure of the report is. But given that we're short on time, I mean, the report's available to you. I'm certainly, if you want to email me questions, I'm happy to talk about it. But yeah, I think I want to skip to why we'd like to see hopefully a technical advisory council or a similar body. You know, in my eyes, there are three real sort of areas to look at. And one is, I think, is sort of the political area, the philosophy. What is this report? What do these calculations mean, both to the General Assembly, but then also to Vermonters? You know, Ellen would speak to the fact that there are a lot of employers out there that refer to this. I think my perspective is what can we do as the Joint Fiscal Office with this report to help you shape policy? So there are two elements to this. There's the outside view of what does it mean to employers, and then there's the inside the State House view of what does this report mean to you, and what, you know, if you if it's not providing the value that it could, how could it be modified? What additional features could be included to help you make decisions on a lot of the important issues that you're dealing with? So there's that philosophy, that political element, and then there are sort of the more the other elements of okay, based on this new philosophy, how should we change the statute to reflect that? Do we continue to run the same definition of what a livable wage is, what a basic needs budget is? Do we add telecom as an official piece of that, or do we sort of broaden do we create like a broader category of personal expenses that would give families discretion to spend? I mean, I think most families, if not all, are going to have some level of telecommunications. It's absolutely necessary. So maybe it's better to keep that as a separate category. But as far as clothing, which isn't defined, maybe that should be added to this personal expense niche where families can sort of make decisions on what their priorities are. You know, maybe you don't need to buy clothes every month, which we actually calculate as a part of this. And then there's a methodology. So now we have this philosophy that maybe has changed or maybe hasn't. Maybe we have the statute that's maybe changed, we hasn't. Now we shape this group shapes the methodology based on that. Okay, what data have we used historically? Is there something better out there? Or based on a change to the statute, the philosophy, what additional data do we need? And I guess, I think I'll end it with that. I've gone on way too long, so
let's just leave it there and have you and Ellen bring it home, just in terms of like what the near future could look like. Again, we'll see the bill about this task force this afternoon, as early as
okay.
Then you're together.
But Dan, I appreciate you coming in, and I could, definitely, having experience with a few of these now.
Do you chance have a copy of the?
Attention being paid to it and the need to change, to recognize it. And I know the last several years have potentially skewed a lot of things. But even if the pandemic didn't happen, I think we'd be feeling like there is a certain age to what we're doing here. Ellen?
No, I was actually wondering, do you happen to have on your slides the actual, the way that an individual family break down the detail of the budget?
No, I actually didn't add that to my slide.
It might be useful if folks could bring it up, because I think some of the questions that you all had, if you were to take a look at in the report itself, for instance, and look at one of the 6 pages that has the actual family profile, the urban and the rural numbers, and if you actually take a look at the line items that are in that, and you take a look at those numbers and then think about it from your own perspective. Like, what are you personally paying for housing? What are you paying for childcare? What are you paying for transportation? I think what you will get from this is that these numbers are actually really conservative. This was designed as a bare bones budget, right? This was not, and there was a lot of sort of fights in the early years around, well, should we include savings or not? And well, should there really be life insurance or not? And well, ages 4 and 6, what about, hungry teenagers, right? And it gets to your point, Chair Stevens, about like whenever you create methodologies like this, there are really hard decisions that need to get made about your assumptions. So oftentimes people would ask me when I was doing a lot of workshops on this stuff, well, what if I have, I've got teenage boys of 14 and 16, like my food costs are crazy, right? Okay, but you don't have childcare costs, right? Oh, well, you have sports league costs. You have, music costs, lessons costs. Like any of us as individuals will be able to look at this and, well, mine's lesser, mine's more in any of these line items, right? Or I have these additional things. Well, why can't I go on vacation, kind of thing. The point is, this is a reference point, right? That are based on certain assumptions. So So keeping that in mind, what we found, just sort of like rule of thumb, is probably these numbers can fluctuate 5% up or down. But when you ask people who are at this wage level, is this about right? It's about right. It's like, it's good enough, right? And as you were saying, Chair Stevens, it's about then how do we use this from a policy perspective, right? Because anything like this is these are the expenses, right? Any equation is revenue and expenses. And if we want people to break even, then that needs to be it needs to net out to zero. But if you take a look at, go down to the, on the tax ones. So each one of these budgets, then what Dan was saying earlier is you calculate this and then you run it in essence backwards through the 1040 tax form. That was Deb Brighton's brilliant move to figure out the methodology was how are we going to calculate the taxes? Because the taxes are built on the expenses, but we have to understand what the expenses are in order to be able to figure out the tax. It's circular. So she figured out this brilliant way of basically, in essence, running it backwards through the 1040 tax form to get at these calculations of taxes. Because what we're saying is you're paying your bills and your taxes, right, without public subsidy. So this is where you were asking about, if you go to the family ones, that they can see where the child care tax credit is. It comes in here, right? You got the child credit, you got the dependent care credit, you got renters rebates, you got various exemptions, federal tax credits, all that kind of stuff is all bundled up in order to then be able to say, to go back into then the expenses of the household, so that in total, you're paying your taxes and your expenses of your household to get to then what is that wage. That make sense?
Sure.
So that's why I think it's useful to also take a look at the actual detail in these 6 budgets. Because I know you guys only serve on one committee, but over the course of your tenure in this building, you might serve on different, multiple committees, right? And so because this is an equation, if you go back up to the other ones, we could be looking at the revenue side, which could be the tax expenditures, tax credits, wage increases, those kinds of things. But then you can also look at the expenses in terms of where are the opportunities to cut down on savings? So you guys said, well, we want to reduce the cost of childcare costs for families. So we're going to do that through a tax credit, right? To help offset some of the cost that families are paying out of pocket. That's a policy decision that you all made to try to have an impact on families' household income, right? So same thing with telecommunications or transportation or housing or food. Food stamps exist because people at this low income level, for instance, can't afford all what it costs for food, right? So we subsidize that by providing SNAP benefits, which is coming from our collective tax dollars. So those are the kinds of policy discussions and decisions that you can use as a reference point to help inform the policy conversations in the building. It's thinking about both the revenue side as well as the expense side.
One expense that has never been in the budget is debt.
Correct.
Consumer debt. I used to assume, because I went to college, that everybody had, and I have kids who are going to college, that everybody has college debt. I know now, as I should have done then, that that's not true. Not everybody has college debt. However, and not everybody has consumer debt, but those two things exist, and or debt itself exists. We've made an assumption that most of these folks are renters. Curious to know whether or not, what the conscious choice was. I mean, again, I can't assume that everybody here has that there's an average number of debt that would be applicable.
Yeah, the back when the question of should we use data for rent or have home ownership data, the feeling was, if I recall, was that the rental data was just easier to get our hands around. It was more standardized. There was actual data available to look at, whereas housing costs has a humongous range if you're from an ownership perspective. It's also the case that there's still somebody that's owning that building that's renting it out. So how would you factor those kinds of things of people that own multiple houses and things like that? So it felt like, just from a methodological standpoint, that choosing rental, the way that the rental numbers are calculated was sort of going to be the best for this type of a methodology. And the reality is that for a lot of folks at this wage level, they can't afford to buy a house, right? They don't have the down payment necessary, for instance, to get the house. So they are going to be renting. So, and part of it gets to your demographic question, is like, we were looking at realistically, what are the demographic profile of the folks that are in fact earning this level of wage, to have a sense of like, what are their lives like? You know, are they renting? Are they owning? Do they have a car? If they have a car, is it like a beater car? Or is it something on lease? Like, all of those kinds of conversations took place at that summer study back in 1999, really wrestling with this stuff. And ultimately, to the earlier question about why is the single person, the two single people household, which is the $15.33, whatever it is, why was that selected as the livable wage? It's because when we were putting forward 6 different family profiles, it was livable wages, which was really confusing for a lot of employers and for legislators. And the decision was, let's pick one. And then for political reasons, it was the lowest one on the list that got the livable wage, right? Because at the time, it was so different than the minimum wage and so different what most employers were paying, that there was a sticker shock issue that we were dealing with at the time. I don't think that sticker shock issue exists today like it did back then, in part because of the awareness we had over COVID and just seeing the labor shortage that we have now that's really has driven up wages in large part. But back then, to talk about a livable wage being $12.50 an hour when the minimum wage was like $8.50, and most employers you talk to said, well, yeah, $12 job, that's a good job, right? So we had to balance what was going on in the conversation at the time. We may have, you all and the technical advisory committee and JFO might, think about it differently for this next iteration.
Emphasizing that they're political choices, and I don't mean that in a party way, but again,
they're policy choices.
We choose what policy we want to try to put across.
Yeah.
And I think if I had to, as far as like consumer debt and potential student loan debt, if I was going to sort of nudge in a direction, I would say maybe it's useful to consider expanding this category of personal expenses to potentially include more of those things that, we might say, okay, here's, the political decision would be, okay, we're going to set a baseline of this amount of money for personal expenses, but this category is meant to sort of give a family some flexibility to prioritize. Do you go to class and have a little student loan debt, or do you buy a nicer cell phone, or do you buy some toys for your kids? There's that category that you could maybe expand on a little bit, and maybe within the methodology say, here's a list of the things that we sort of assume might fall into this category that we want to leave it to families to be able to sort of choose and not prescribe. We're gonna set a line item for children's toys or student loan debt. I mean, you could expand the list and it'd become a little unwieldy. So you got to sort of prioritize and give families some discretion.
And once I learned that this is a tool that has some amorphousness to it, I stopped getting on my high horse about, well, you're missing this and you're missing that, because it goes on and on and on. So, Representative Crezon?
I just wanted to add a comment, and who among us doesn't know someone who was talking about consumer debt, credit card debt, and then that, causes a spiral of not being able to buy a house or anyway, but there's a lot of different nuance, but that's.
Yeah.
And one of the other things that I think is also useful to keep in mind is we oftentimes, because we're so used to thinking about a minimum wage, or even the livable wage being an hourly number that we can get our heads around, it's often really helpful to then translate that into the annual income. And the easiest way to do it is just basically double the wage and, multiply by 2,000, right? We have 2,040 hours in a full-time work week.
So 40 hours a week.
40 hours a week. So a $15 an hour minimum wage or a livable wage would be a little more than $30,000 a year. So double the hourly and then add 3 zeros, right? And that is a rule of
That's a
thumb.
political choice, because
Right?
it's like, is it 40? Is it 35?
All right, well, let's just stay at,
No, I know.
for right now, let's just,
I'm just like, is
Yeah.
it 60?
right. But when I would talk with a lot of business owners, you're like, oh yeah, no, I definitely support the whole notion of livable wage. And they're like, and $10, $12 an hour is a good wage. And I was like, okay, so 20,000, you live on $20,000 to $22,000 a year? Oh, well, no, that's so low. I'm like, well, that's what that is, right? Like, so I think that's why it's really important that and we designed it this way, that the annual income is also included in here and not just that hourly wage, because it matters from a perception perspective, right? Because it's a reference point. So if you're somebody that lives on $60,000 a year and you can't even imagine cutting any more out of your budget, it's like, okay, well, that's $30 an hour.
Yeah.
So if you're out looking for a new job, what are you looking for? You're looking for at least $30 an hour just to stay even, right? I think that's what's important in this, is to keep in mind as we think about the methodological changes and what this all really means.
And that's, the idea that $15 an hour at 40 hours is $32,000 and at 35 hours is 27,000. I mean, so,
Yeah, exactly.
so just getting those numbers, because $15 an hour sounded awfully rich to some people when we were having that conversation. Representative LaBounty, I just want to make this the last question.
Yeah.
So we have to take an early lunch today. So,
Just really quick, the chamber was in here like a couple of weeks ago, and they told us that out of the 145,000, there are 145,000 people filed taxes made less than 27,000 a year.
I mean, the reality is, being such a small business state, there's an awful lot of people that work for really small businesses that really struggle and they're on the edge. So that's why whenever I get asked to testify in this committee and about the minimum wage, I'm like, yes, and we need to be thinking about the supports for small businesses, because we want them to thrive and succeed and be more profitable, because that then makes it easier for them to pay livable wages. You can't extract money that's not there.
right.
As a
We don't want
business,
small business
right?
to think that the minimum wage is the maximum wage.
Exactly. And again, from a belief perspective, I rarely will ever run into a business owner that doesn't say, I want to pay my workers a livable wage. That's not what we're talking about. It really gets to the how can we support workers and how can we support employers and get those boats all rising. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank
both
you.
Thank you.
for this. Appreciate it, and we will,
Thanks, Ellen. It's great to hear from you.
we'll keep the report with us as we always
Follow
do.
up on all kinds of.
Thank you. And then we'll have you in when we talk about the bill.
Great.
Thanks,
So
everybody.
much.
Thanks.